Welcome listeners, today I'm going over Demonology and Demon Lore by Monsieur Daniel Conway. This is a continuation of the Demon Lore series that I do here, where I narrate his works and add value where I can, like snipping out content that just frankly has aged so poorly that no one would get the references. For today's episode, the author spends more time on winter and what winter means to cultures, specifically how a culture draws on winter as an extreme to influence perception of demons and the devil, and gods. Monsieur does enjoy spending time on the etymology of what makes up the thought or idea of a demon in relation to winter, and spends the first half covering off what winter means to cultures from around the world. Then moves to the mid-second half of this chapter, specifically on god and demon myth. So if you love your research, and love to find out what makes cultures tick, and origins for words like cinders, coal, and flame, plus lore and mythology from very old cultures, this is the episode for you. Sit back, relax, and let me share some unique demonology and demon lore all the way back from 1879. Chapter 3. Cold, and how the topic of winter and demons share an intrinsic link. Even across immemorial generations, it is impossible to read without emotion the legend of descent of Ishtar into Hades. Through 7 gates the goddess of love passes in search of her beloved, and at each some of her ornaments and clothing are removed by the dread guardian. Ishtar enters naked into the presence of the Queen of Death, but gods, men, and herds languish in her absence. The Saviour so charms the infernal queen that she bids the judge of her realm, Anunnaki, absolve Ishtar from his golden throne. This is how the paragraph goes. This is the paragraph of absolution. He poured out for Ishtar the waters of life and let her go. Then the first gate let her forth, and restored to her the first garment of her body. The second gate let her forth, and restored to her the diamond of her hands and feet. The third gate let her forth, and restored to her the central girdle of her waist. The fourth gate let forth, and restored to her the small lovely gems of her forehead. The fifth gate let her forth, and restored to her the precious stones of her head. The sixth gate let her forth, and restored to her the earrings of her ears. And the seventh gate let her forth, and restored to her the great crown on her head. This old miracle play of nature, the return of summer flower by flower, is deciphered from an ancient Assyrian tablet in a town within only a few hours of another, where a circle of worshippers repeat the same at every solstice. Maefir Morganwg, the arch-druid, adores still here by name as his saviour, and at the winter solstice assembles his brethren to celebrate his coming to bruise the head of the serpent of Hades. Is this a survival? No doubt, but there is no cult in the world which, if scratched, as the proverb says, will not reveal beneath it the same conception. However, it may be spiritualized. Every plan of salvation is cast in the mold of winter, conquered by the sun. The descent of love to the underworld, the delivery of the imprisoned germs of life. It is very instructive to compare with the myth of Ishtar that of Hermodr, seeking the release of Baldur the Beautiful from Helheim. The deadly powers of winter are represented in the Eddaic accounts of Baldur, soft summer light, the Norse Baal. His blind brother Hodur is darkness. The demon who directed his arrow is Loki, subterranean fire. The arrow itself is of mistletoe which, fostered by winter, owes no duty to Baldur. And the realm to which he is born is that of Hell, the frozen zone. Hermodr, having arrived, assured Hel that the gods were in despair for the loss of Baldur. The queen replied that it should now be tried whether Baldur was so loved. If, therefore, all things in the world, both living and lifeless, weep for him, he would return to heaven. In the end, all wept but the old hag, Thok, her personification coined as Darkness, who from her cavern sang, "Thok will wail, with dry eyes, Baldur's balefire. Naught quick or dead, for Kal soon care I, let Hel hold her own." So, Baldur remained in Helheim. The myth very closely resembles that of Ishtar's descent. In similar accent, the messenger of the southern god weeps and lacerates himself as he relates to the grief of the upper world, and all men and animals since the time that Mother Ishtar descended into Hades. But in the latter, the messenger is successful. In the north, though, he's unsuccessful. In the corresponding myths of warm and sunny climes, the effort at release is more or less successful in proportion to the extent of winter. And in Adonis, released from Hades for 4 months every year and another 4 if he chose to abandon Persephone for Aphrodite, we have a reflection of a variable year. That and the similar myth of Persephone varied in the time specified for their passing in the upper and underworlds, probably in accordance with the climatic averages of the regions in which they were told. But in the tropics it was easy to believe the release complete, as in the myth of Ishtar. In Mangaean myths, the hero, Maui, escapes from another world of fire, aided by a red pigeon. When this contest between winter's death and summer's triumph became humanized, it was Hercules vanquishing death and completely releasing Alcestis. When it became spiritualized, it was as Christ conquering death and hell, and releasing the spirits from prison. But the myth of a swift resurrection had to be artificially preserved in the far north. The legend of a full triumph over death and hell could never have originated among our Norse ancestors. Their only story resembling it, that of Iduna, related how her recovery from the giants brought back health to the gods, not men. But it was from the south that men had to hear tidings of a rescue for the earth and man. We cannot realize now what glad tidings were they which told this new gospel to people sitting in regions of ice and gloom, after it had been imposed on them against their reluctant fears. In manifold forms, the old combat was renewed in their festivals, and people who had long been prostrate and helpless before the terrible powers of nature were never weary of the southern fables of heroic triumphs over them, long interpreted in the simple physical sense. The great demon of the northern world is still winter, and the hereditary hatred of him is such that he is still cursed, scourged, killed, and buried or drowned under various names and disguises. In every Slavonic country, there are to be found, about carnival time, traces of ancient rites, intended to typify the death of winter and the birth of spring or summer. In Poland, a puppet made of hemp or straw is flung into a pond or swamp with the words, "The devil take thee." Then the participators in the deed scamper home, and if one of them stumbles and falls, it is believed he will die within the year. In Upper Alsatia, a similar figure is fastened on a pole to be pelted, then taken to the village boundary and thrown across it or cast into the water. Its bearers returning with green boughs. Sometimes the figure is shrouded in white, representing snow, and bears in its hands a broom, the sweeping storm, and a sickle, the fatal reaper. In Russia, the straw mujik is burned, and also in Bulgaria. In the latter, the bonfire is accompanied by the fire of guns, and by dances and songs to Lado, the goddess of spring. This reminiscence of Leto, on whose account Apollo slew the python, is rendered yet more striking by the week of archery which accompanies it, recalling the sunbeam dance of the god. In Spain and Italy, the demon puppet is scourged under the name of Judas, as indeed is the case for the Good Friday performance of Portuguese sailors in the London docks. Another similar custom in Mexico, the Judas being dressed up as a regular horned and hoofed devil. In Scotland, the pre-Christian accessories of a corresponding custom are more pronounced both in the time selected and the place. And the clave is the custom of burning the puppets of winter, and in this case accounted for in 1878 at Berghead. a fishing village near Forez, where stands an old Roman altar locally named the Daru. A tar barrel was set on fire and carried by a fisherman around the town, while the people shouted and hallooed. If the man who carries the barrel falls, it is an evil omen. The lit barrel, having gone round the town, was carried to the top of the hill and placed on the Daru. More fuel was added. The sparks, as they fly upwards, are supposed to be the witches and evil spirits leaving the town. The people therefore shout and curse them as they disappear in vacancy. When the burning tar barrel falls in pieces, the fishwomen rush in and endeavour to get a lighted bit of wood from its remains. With this light, the fire on the cottage hearth is at once kindled, and it is considered lucky to keep this flame alive all the rest of the year. The charcoal of the clave is collected and put into bits up the chimney to prevent the witches and evil spirits coming down into the house. The Daru is covered with a thick layer of tar from the fires that are annually lighted upon it, and close to the claves are very ancient Roman wells. It is an instance of the irony of etymology that the word hell means a place of fireless darkness, nor is the fact that the name of the Scandinavian demoness Hel, phonetically corresponding with Kali, the Black One, Goth, Halja, whose abode was an icy hole, has her name preserved as a place of fiery torment without significance. In regions where cold was known to an uncomfortable extent, as well as heat, we usually find it represented in the ideas of future punishment. The realm called Hades, meaning just the same as hell, suggests cold. Tertullian and Jerome say that Christ's own phrases, outer darkness, and the gnashing or chattering of teeth suggests a place of extreme cold alternating with the excessive heat. Traces of similar speculations are found with the rabbis. Gehenna had both water and fire. Noah saw the angel of death approaching and hid from him for 12 months. Why 12? Because, the rabbis explain, such is the trial of sinners. 6 in water, 6 in fire. For example, Dante has frigid as well as burning hells, and the idea was refined by some scholiasts to a statement which would seem to make the alternations of future punishment amount to a severe sickness and fever. There are also blended rabbinical notions, painting the terrible picture of the frozen continent, where he writes, "The parching air burns frore, and cold forms the effect of fire, thither by harpy-footed furies hold. At certain revolutions all the damned are brought, and feel by turns the bitter change of fierce extremes, extremes by change more fierce, from beds of raging fire to starve in ice, their soft ethereal warmth, and there to pine, immovable, infixed, and frozen round." With which may be compared Shakespeare's lines in Measure for Measure. The delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice. Delving deep into Tibet culture, Tibet hell is believed to have 16 circles, 8 burning, 8 frozen, which attributes to the rapid changes of their climate between the extremes of heat and cold. Plutarch, relating the vision of Thespius in Hades, speaks of the frozen region there. Denis Le Chartreux says the severest of infernal torments is freezing. In the Calendar of Shepherds, 1506, a legend runs, Lazarus said, "I saw a floody of prosown ice, in the witchy, envious men and women were prolonged unto the navel, and then suddenly came a coldy wideny right great, that blew and died deep down, all the envious into the coldy water, that nothing was seen of them." The demon of cold has a habitat naturally in every northern region. He is the Ki Mung of China, who, man-shaped, dragon-headed, haunts the Chang River. In Greenland it is Erelur Sartok, who suffers perpetual agony and leaps on soul at death to satisfy his hunger. The Chinos, demons of the Mimacs of Nova Scotia, present certain features of the race demons, but are fearfully cold. The Chennu weapon is a dragon's horn. His yell is fatal to the hearer. His heart is a block of ice. This heart must be destroyed if the demon is to be slain, but it can only be done by melting it in the fire. The chief precaution required is that one is not drowned in the flood so caused. The icy demon survived long in Scotland, accounted for by Sir James Melville in his memoirs, says, "The spirit or devil that helped the Scottish witches to raise the storm in the Sea of Norway was cold as ice, and his body hard as iron. His face was terrible, his nose like the beak of an eagle, with great burning eyes, his hands and legs hairy, with claws of his nails like a griffin." This type of demon haunted people's mind in Scandinavia, where through traditions of a flame demon, Loki, and the end of the world by fire were imported, the popular beliefs seem to have been mainly occupied with frost giants and the formidable Oiger, god of the Black Sea east winds, preserved in our word Or, Anglo-Saxon, Eri, and more directly in the name of our familiar demon, the ogre, so often slain in the child's Gladshim. Loki, spirit fire, was indeed speedily relegated by the Aesir, the gods, to a hidden subterraneous realm, where his existence could only be known by the earthquakes, geysers, and Hekla eruptions which he occasioned. Yet he was to come forth at Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. We can see a singular blending of tropical and frigid zones, the one traditional, the other native. In the prose Edda, Ganglia asks, "What will remain? After heaven and earth, and the whole universe shall be consumed, and after all the gods and the homes of Valhalla and all mankind shall have perished, there will be many abodes," replied Thridi, "some good, some bad. The best place of all to be in will be Gimel, in heaven, and all who delight in quaffing good drink will find a great store in the hall called Brimmer, which is also in heaven in the region of Okolini. There is also a fair hall of ruddy gold, Sindra, which stands on the mountains of Nida. In those halls, righteous and well-minded men shall abide. In Nystrond, there is a vast and direful structure with doors that face the north. It is formed entirely of the backs of serpents, wattled together like wickerwork. But the serpents' heads are turned towards the inside of the hall, and continuously vomit forth floods of venom, in which wade all those who commit murder, or who forswear themselves, as it is said in the Volspar. She saw a hall, far from the sun, in Nastrond standing. Northward the doors look, and venom drops fall in through loopholes. Formed is that hall of wreathed serpents. There saw she wade through heavy streams, men forsworn and murderers. These names for the heavenly regions and their occupants indicate sunshine and fire. Gimel means fire, Gemir. Brimmer, Brimmy, means flame. The giant and Sindri, cinder. The dwarf, jeweler of the gods, are raised to halls of gold. Nothing is said of a garden or walking therein in the cool of day. On the other hand, Nastrond means strand of the dead, in that region whose doors face the north, far from the sun. We behold an inferno of extreme cold. Christianity has not availed to give the Icelanders any demonic name suggestive of fire. They speak of Skrati, the roarer, and Kolski, the coal black one, but promise nothing so luminous and comfortable as fire or fire fiend to the evildoer. In the great epic of Niblugan Lied, we have probably the shape in which the Northman's dream of paradise is finally cohered. A rose garden in the south guarded by a huge worm, a water snake or glittering glacial sea, whose glowing charms with beauty for their queen could be won only by a brave dragon-slaying Siegfried. Now we look at England, partly because of an account of its harsh climate, once had the reputation of being the chief abode of demons. A demoness leaving her lover on the continent says, "My mother is calling me in England." In Christianizing Ireland, Iona, and other islands far north, it was preliminary to expel the demons. The Clave, the Daciul, and other Hebrides islands, fire carried round cattle to defend them from demons, and around mothers not yet churched to keep the babes from being changed. Show that the expulsion still goes on, though in such regions Norse and Christian notions have become so jumbled that it is fighting the devil with fire. So in the Havamal, men are warned to invoke fire for distempers. And they sing, "Raise ye Giles an oaken pile, let it under heaven the lightest be. May it burn a breast full of woes, the fire round my heart is sorrow's melt." The last line is in contrast with the Hindu saying, "The flame of her husband's pyre cools the widow's breast." The characters of the northern heaven and hell survive in the English custom of burying the dead on the southern side of the church. How widely this usage prevailed may be seen by reference on churchyards. The north side of the graveyard was set apart for unbaptized infants and executed criminals, and it was permitted the people to dance or play tennis in that part. Others say that in the churchyard at Morwenstow, the southern portion only contains graves, the north part being untenanted, as the Cornish believe, following old traditions, that the north is the region of demons. In some parishes of Cornwall, when a baptism occurs, the north door of the nave opposite the front is thrown open, so that the devil, cast out, may retire to his own region, the north. Indeed, it is not improbable that the fact noted by White in his History of Selborne that the usual approach to most country churches is by the south, indicating a belief that the sacred edifice should turn its back on the regions of demons. It is a singular instant of survival which has brought about the fact that people who listen devoutly to sermons describing the fiery character of Satan and his abode should surround the very churches in which those sermons are heard with evidences of their lingering faith that the devil belongs to the region of ice, and that their dead must be buried in the direction of the happy abode of Brimmer and Sindri, fire and cinders. Lenormant has written an extremely instructive chapter in comparison of the Akkadian and the Finnish mythologies. He there shows that they are as one and the same tree, adapted to antagonistic climates, with similar triad, ruins, charms, and even names in some cases. Their regard for the fire worshipped by both varies in a way that seems at first glance somewhat anomalous. The Akkadians in their fire worship exhausted the resources of praise in ascription of glory and power to the flames. The Finns in their cold home celebrated the fire festival at the winter solstice, uttered invocations over the fire, and the mother of the family, with her domestic libations, said, "Always rise so high, O my flame, but burn not larger nor more ardent." The diminution of enthusiasm in the northern fire worshipper as compared may only be the result of euphemism in the latter, or perhaps while the formidable character of the fire god among the primitive Assyrians is indicated in the utter prostration before him. The true nature of this anomaly becomes visible when we consider that the great demon, dreaded by the two countries drawing their cult from a common source, represented the excess of the power most dreaded. The demon in each case was a wind. Among the Finns, the north wind. Among the Akkadians, the southwest, most fiery winds. The Finnish demon was Hiisi, speeding on his pale horse through the air, with a terrible train of monster dogs, cats, furies, scattering pain, disease, and death. The Akkadian demon, of which the bronze image is the Lauvur, is the body of a dog, erect on eagle's feet, its arms pointed with lion's paws. It has the tail of a scorpion and the head of a skeleton, half stripped of flesh, preserving the eyes. And mounted with the horns of a goat, it has 4 outspread wings. On the back of this ingeniously horrible image is an inscription in the Akkadian language, appraising us that it is the demon of the southwest wind, made to be placed at the door or window to avert its hostile action. As we observe such figures as these on the one hand, and on the other hand the fair beings imagined to be antagonistic to them, we must note in ruins and incantations how intensely the ancients felt themselves to be surrounded by these gods and evil powers, and, reading nature so, learn to see in the seasons successfully conquering and conquered by each other, an alternation of longer days and longer nights, the changing fortunes of a never-ending battle. We may better realize the meaning of solstitial festivals, the customs that gathered around Yuletide and New Year, and the manifold survivals from them, which annually masquerade in Christian costume and names. To our sun-worshipping ancestors, the New Year meant the first faint advantage of the warmer time over winter, as nearly as it could be fixed for those waiting for winter to end. The hovering of day between superiority of light and darkness is now named, and comparisons drawn. At Yuletide, the dawning victory of the sun is seen as a holy infant in a manger amid beasts of the stall. The old nature worship has bequeathed to Christian belief close-fitting mantles, but the old idea of a war between the wintry and the warm powers still haunts the period of the new year. And the 12 days and nights once believed to be the period of a fiercely contested battle between good and evil demons are still regarded by many as a period for special watchfulness and prayer. New Year's Eve in the north of England still uses the phrase Hogmanay, also known as Midwinter Night, when the sacrifices of Thor were prepared, formerly had many observances which reflected the belief that good and evil ghosts were contending for every man and woman. The air was believed to be swarming with them, and watch must be kept to see that the protecting fire did not go out in any household, that no strange man, woman, or animal approached, possibly a demon in disguise. Sacred plants were set indoors and windows to prevent the entrance of any malevolent being from the multitudes filling the air. John Wesley, a man whose noble heart was allied with a mind strangely open to stories of hobgoblins, led the way of churches and sects back into this ancient atmosphere. Nevertheless, the rationalism of the age has influenced St. Wesley's feast. Titled Watch Night, it can hardly recognise its brother in the Boar's Head Banquet of Queen's College, Oxford, which celebrated victory over Tuscany winter, the decapitated demon whose bristles were once icicles. Yet, what the Watch Night really signifies, in that antiquarian sense, is just that old culminating combat between the powers of fire and frost, once believed to determine human fates. In White Russia on New Year's Day, when the annual elemental battle has been decided, the killed and wounded on one hand and the fortunate on the other are told by carrying from house to house the rich and the poor, kolyadas. These are two children, one dressed in fine attire and crowned with a wreath of full ears of grain, the other ragged and wearing a wreath of threshed straw. These having been closely covered, each householder is called in and chooses one. If his choice chances upon the poor kolyada, the attending chorus chant a mournful strain, in which he is warned to expect a bad harvest, poverty, and perhaps death. If he selects the rich kolyada, a cheerful song is sung promising him harvest, health, and wealth. The natives of certain districts of Dagestan assign political and social significance to their Feast of Fire, which is celebrated in the month preceding winter, at new moon, just after their meat provision for the season is laid into dry. Their legend has it that it is when their national hero slew their ancient tyrant and introduced good government. This legend, related elsewhere, is of a tyrant slain through the discovery that his heart was made of snow. He was slain by the warmth of torches. In the celebrations, all the men of the villages go forth with torches which they swing round their heads and throw in the direction of Gilgit, where the snow-hearted tyrant so long held his castle. When the husbands return home from their torch throwing, a little drama is rehearsed The wives refuse them entrance till they have entreated, recounting the benefits that they have brought them. After admission, the husband affects sulkiness, and must be brought round with caress to join in the banquet. The wife leads him forward with this song: Thou hast made me glad, thou favourite of the Rajah. Thou hast rejoiced me, O bold horseman. I am pleased with thee, who so well set the gun and sword. Thou hast delighted me, O thou invested with a mantle of honours. O great happiness, I will buy it by giving pleasure's price. O thou nourishment to us, heap of corn, store of ghee, delighted will I buy it all by giving pleasure's price. And this concludes chapter 3 of Demonology and Devil lore. I'm writing this because my family won't talk about it anymore. I'm the only one who can't seem to forget. I was raised on the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of around 5,000. My more immediate community was an isolated, dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. Less than 20 families lived on the Bear Creek. I didn't mind being so isolated. I grew up in the comfort of wide fields and close neighbours that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-centred, very community-centred. All the young girls, myself included, were part of the young women's group, and all of the boys were members of the local Boy Scout troop, which doubled as a church group in our area. We had 4th of July parties at the local ballpark and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a good, quiet community. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, was situated on a small hill surrounded by a wide grass field on one side, and a snaking dirt road on the other. Across the road was the creek bottoms. Southern Idaho is categorized in a desert climate, so not much grows outside of the irrigated fields besides sage, brush, and burrs. The creek bottoms were the exception. The creek fed the growth of a thick tangle of pussy willow bushes. In the late fall, we used to go down into the bottoms and pick the white, cottony pussy willow seeds to decorate the fences of our driveway. Being so isolated, it wasn't uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains. We had a female moose who brought her calf down and lived in our orchard every winter, and the occasional lion wasn't unheard of either. The summer when I turned 8, I remember, because it was the same year as my baptism. A smaller mountain lion was spotted several times in our area. We weren't worried. The big cat stayed away from the farms and usually moved on when the area didn't yield enough food. The same summer, my neighbor, Peyton, was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be pretty cool to try putting together a National Geographic submission on our little creek bottoms. The young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time made him especially excited. He decided he wanted to try and get pictures of the lion and email the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that takes shots every couple of seconds in an area the lion was known to visit. They also recommended setting some kind of bait, so the lion was more likely to come by. No one in the creek liked the idea of live bait or carrion, so we came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to set up an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it on loop through a set of speakers hidden in the willows. I remember when everyone was down in the bottoms testing the speaker, and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of a dying rabbit is horrible. It's been described as being almost identical to the sound of a screaming child. If you've never heard it yourself, there's plenty of recordings online. It's worth a listen. The camera was set up. The speakers were set up. Everything was perfect. Peyton explained that he would allow the camera and recording to play uninterrupted for a week, and then he would go check on it. This would give time for our scent to fade from the bottoms and encourage the lion to come closer. At first, I was worried about the noise. It was a truly horrible noise, and our house was the closest to the setup point in the bottoms. My father assured me that the noise wouldn't reach us as far as our house, and I was relieved when we arrived home that night. And he was correct. The bottoms were far enough away that I couldn't hear anything. I remember Peyton the next day at church. He was fidgety and excited to check on the equipment, but he had to wait a week, which everybody kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down too early and scaring the lion away for good. That night I woke up to an awful noise. I sat ramrod straight in my bed with my eyes wide in the dark. Hand clutched so hard, my palms bore the indent of my fingernails for hours after. I knew that noise. It was the recording of the rabbit. It sounded faint and far off, like it really could have been coming from the bottoms. But that was impossible, because the recordings had been going all night the previous day, and I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of bed and wake my parents. The recording played over and over again. I had the loop memorized. In the morning I stumbled out into the kitchen for breakfast. My mum and dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark rings under their eyes. I hadn't been the only one who'd heard it. Mum was convinced that the equipment must have been broken. She wanted to go down into the bottoms to check it out. Dad refused. He was a kind, gentle man and didn't want to stir up any unnecessary drama. He was sure there had been a strong wind last night, and the wind was carrying the noise farther than its natural reach. He told us to listen. We did. He was right. We couldn't hear it now. We forgot about it and went about our daily goings. The next night, it happened again. I stayed up in bed with my back to the wall. The screaming was even louder than before. But this time, something was different. It was lower pitched than I remember, and parts of the loop were slowed down, as if the recording were warped in places. At times the loop did not loop naturally, and instead picked up at a random place in the middle. My mum didn't mention anything at the breakfast table, but both her and my dad seemed tense. The third night I mustered the courage to stand beside my bedroom window and look out into the yard. For a moment I stood, rooted to the spot, my hands shaking no matter how hard I clenched them. The noise sidled in through the cracks in the windows. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred their branches. My mum announced that she would be going to visit her sisters in the town the next day, and would probably spend the night there. She invited me to come along, but I was a daddy's girl at heart, and chose to stay at the farm. I took Mum's place beside Dad in their bed that night, but even that didn't help. I don't think my dad was asleep either, for he was unnaturally still the whole night. We began to hear the noise during the day too. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was only one scream, a short, high-pitched one, and then the recording fell silent. It happened again several times throughout the day, but never the whole loop. Just clips from it. Later that evening, Peyton's dad came up the driveway on his four-wheeler. He said he was looking for their dog, a sweet yellow lab, who had been missing since that morning. Dad said that he was sorry and he hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the recording, but he didn't. He was a quiet man after all. He didn't want to bring up any unnecessary drama. Mum stayed away the whole week. Dad and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, the screaming could be heard constantly, though it seemed to have deviated from the familiar loop entirely. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screams were thin and long, other times they were hardly more than growls. Once, while my dad had been heating up meatloaf for lunch, the noise rose into such a rancorous din that he dropped the plate and it shattered. I pressed my hands over my ears where I sat at the table and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The noise forced its way in through the cracks of my fingers and pinched my throat and rattled in my ribcage. The din lasted for a whole minute, then fell silent. Dad was shaking. That was the last we heard of the noise that day. Peyton came by Saturday evening to ask permission to cross our road to collect the equipment. He was so excited. I watched him disappear into the creek bottoms with a sense of tired relief. After that equipment was gone, it would all stop. I couldn't wait to get a full night's sleep. Not a minute later, I spotted Peyton coming back up from the creek. I was confused. It had taken us much longer to set up the camera and speakers, so I'd only assumed it would take just as long to collect them. My breath stilled when Peyton came close. He didn't look right. His eyes were wide and his face pale. Something wet dribbled from his chin and onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. My dad caught him before he fell and demanded to know what had happened. Peyton couldn't speak. He just cried. We called his dad. I looked after Peyton and both my dad and his dad went into the bottoms. They were gone a long time. When they returned, their faces were grim, and they smelled funny. I noticed red on my dad's hand. I asked what was wrong, but they brushed right past me and immediately called the police. Nobody would tell me what had happened. I sat on the couch as a blur of neighbors and police officers swirled around me. At one point, an officer placed something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen curiously. It was the camera from the bottoms. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little banged up. Tiny scratches and dents covered the plastic casing. When I lifted it, my hand stuck to the plastic. Something tacky and odorous covered the screen. But it turned on fine. The first set of photos were normal, just the Pussy Willows cast green in the glow of the night setting. As I continued to click through them, they quickly became strange. At one point the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked from its post. Grass now obscured most of the frame. Flecks of red appeared on the lens and remained for the rest of the sets. One photo made me pause. There was a figure in this one, or half a figure as most of the upper torso hadn't made it into the frame. I thought it could be human, but it didn't look like it should be standing upright. Its legs were twisted, like an animal, and it seemed to be having difficulty supporting itself in an upright position. Beside the legs, a long, thin arm hung. Whatever it was must have been stooped over, for its fingertips hung below its crooked knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up, and was now being held. The first photo was of the bottoms at night. The next startled me. I had to look closely before deciding what it was. A rabbit had been laid in the bushes, but its ears and most of its scalp had been peeled away. The next was of the same rabbit, but a thin, dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its limp body hung like something from a nightmare. In the following photos, more rabbits joined the one, each with their ears and scalp removed. Then a cat, then more cats, then a dog, the yellow lab, then the lion. The following photos was of 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog, and the lion all laid out in a row, facing the same way. Their arms and legs had been arranged as if they were marching, like some parade. All of their scalps had been removed, and tiny white glints of their skulls could be seen. The last photo was overly bright, like the photo had been taken too close with the flash on. An eye dominated the frame, but it was yellowed and crusty, and had a bar pupil like a horse. In the bottom corner, the edge of a mouth could be seen. No lips, just teeth. Sharp and little, with wide gaps of red gum between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my dad talking to the police outside. They said the speakers had malfunctioned. The recording had only played the first night. Bunnies. In 1998, one of the most disturbing discoveries of the 20th century was made in a small town in the state of Alabama. During that summer, a few residents of the city of Roebuck alerted the authorities to the presence of a decaying, rusty trailer located on the outskirts of the city, just a few yards away from a small residential area. Occasionally, faint screams and groans could be heard coming from the inside of the seemingly abandoned trailer during the late afternoon hours of the day, which most of the residents of the small neighborhood mistook for children playing, until one day, an elderly woman living alone in one of the homes grew paranoid about the distressing noises and called the police. When they arrived, the authorities quickly began to search the small trailer. Upon first glance, it did indeed seem to be deserted. The only furnishings found inside were a slight rusted metal folding chair, a stained, flower-patterned couch that held the strong smell of mildew, and a surprisingly new-looking patio table. To the police squad's befuddlement, there seemed to be nothing too suspicious inside of the trailer. The same did not go for the small space underneath it, however. Under a poorly covered mound of dirt, a small briefcase was excavated from the bottom of the old trailer. Inside it, the authorities discovered 14 VHS tapes with no label or stickers whatsoever. The content of the tapes was pretty much all exactly the same, but they all had different people featured in them. The tapes all started out in the same fashion, an immediate fade in from black that revealed a small child strapped into the same metal chair that was found in the trailer. The children also seemed to have the same terrified expression on their faces as the camera started to focus on them, their eyes all red and sunken in. Despite the black duct tape over their mouths, they could all be heard sobbing. A few seconds into the video, the child in question would suddenly look up and start crying even harder than before. The shadow of the cameraman was always seen in this portion of the videos, and he seemed to be holding up a small animal of some sort. Judging by the shape of the shadow its body would cast and the small whimpers it made, it was almost likely a rabbit or something similar. The cameraman held the animal above his head for a short portion of time, before abruptly swinging it into the air and then throwing it down onto the ground, with such force that it let out a horrible shriek. You could hear a few bones breaking and snapping as well. As you may imagine, this only made the child cry and scream, but the sound was muffled and barely audible. As the child was screaming, the cameraman picked up the still-breathing rabbit and played around with it, swinging its limp little body back and forth, and bouncing it up and down. You could see a large amount of blood coming out of it. In the middle of this, the cameraman would always ask, "What's wrong?" and then the name of the child. "I thought you loved animals." The child did not respond at all. He or she merely sobbed quietly. The cameraman then took an obviously fraudulent sad tone of voice. "Oh, there. You can still play with the bunny after I'm done playing with it, okay?" Upon saying this, the man took out a large hunting knife and immediately drove it into the rabbit's stomach. The shrieks and squeals of the terrified creature seemed to cause mixed reactions in the children. In a few of the videos, the children seemed to faint at this horrific sight. Others only sat and tried to scream. In the worst case they saw, a small girl who seemed to be around the age of 6 apparently vomited. But since her mouth was taped closed, a bit of it came out of her nostrils, which made her scream in agony. Then she seemed to go limp as her eyes rolled back in her head. The video cut off prematurely in this case. For the children that stayed awake, the cameraman tossed his hunting knife on the floor beside him, and then swung the dead rabbit above his head like a helicopter blade. Blood and innards went all over the inside of the trailer, and all over the terrified children. As they continued to cry even harder, their terrified little eyes focused on the left side of them suddenly, as the man said, "Look!" Then the name of the child. "It wants to say hello to you." Immediately after this was said, the video abruptly cuts off. The ending of their videos were all exactly the same thing. A red-tinted picture of a cross was shown in the background as the words, "Thanks for visiting," then the name of the child. were displayed in white letters at the top with "Jesus loves you" being displayed at the bottom. Ever since this case, the city of Roebuck has gained some level of infamy in the state of Alabama. Even though the case was first opened in 1992, no further evidence of any murders has ever been found in the area. None of the children were ever identified, and ever since then, the old rusty trailer has been torn down, and now the area serves as the location of a children's playground. If you ever decide to visit there, I bet you'd be surprised at the number of wild rabbits that occupy the area. Strangely, they love playing with the kids that go there, and a few of them even try and follow them home.